I am making this video because I already had it edited and the script written. I would have preferred to start over, but I had nothing else to upload this day, plus I think it's a nice waistband detail worth knowing. We are cutting the trouser in the normal way, the front and the back, top side and underside. The first distinction though is the waistband. I need to take more care because I want the fabric patterns to line up, but it won't be so different with plain fabrics. The waistband has two parts this time. We want both to be about half the waist, or a quarter of the waist, plus 16 centimeters of inlay. As always, at least 6 centimeters tall. That's the waistband pieces cut, always marking the wrong sides. For the Daks, we need a rectangle of arbitrary size. I suggest 5 centimeters or so by 15 centimeters or so. Because the fabric is patterned, I'm cutting mine excessively large so that I can definitely match them nicely. And I label it as Daks because otherwise it might just be another random scrap that I lose or forget about. We also cut 2 rectangles of silicea the same size as our Daks fabric. We can make the paper pattern for Daks one time and keep using it. Take some fairly heavy paper, lining paper or pattern paper. With a sharp pencil or fine pen, start with a horizontal line. Pick a point and at right angles make a second line. On that line, you can choose to very precisely mark the 15mm and 30mm point, or the 16 and 32mm point from the original line. We'll get freaky with it, but those are about average. On the first line, measure 11 centimeters from the second, and then 15 or 16 millimeters from there. The idea is the height of the point is half the width of its base. Square both of those points up, and on one of them also measure 15 or 16 and 30 or 32 millimeters as appropriate. Join our points that we marked, creating basically 4 smaller rectangles very precisely. We want the middle line to be exactly in the center of the outer 2, with the smaller rectangles at the end. As demonstrated, join up the intersecting points to create an arrow shape. It is very important that we cut very precisely around, as much care as we put into drawing it. We trace it out directly, so we need to be very strict. Make sure the chalk is sharp. Firstly, put your fabric and silicea together, place them right sides to right sides. Usually I trace the Dak pattern on the silicea side because the cotton tends to take the chalk a bit better, but I want to get this pattern lined up properly. So I'm working fabric side up, but usually I'm chalking the silicea. Hold the template down very tightly and trace very closely exactly on the border. With appropriate paper, we can almost push the chalk towards the paper and use the corner it creates. Again, it would be silicea side up, but the side with the chalk up, we go to the machine. On a slightly smaller stitch, start on one side of the Dak and back tack. Very precisely on the chalk, if slightly towards the inside of the Dak. When we get to the corner, we want to make sure we are exactly on the corner. That could mean lifting the foot and the needle and moving the deck into the corner. Turn the deck to machine up to the point. We need to count the number of stitches up to the corner, and if we come up slightly short, lift the foot and needle to move the deck and stick the needle into the corner. Remember the number of stitches to check that it's the same going down on the other side, and if we came up short the first time, we should come up short again, lift the foot and the needle and move the deck, but only by the same or as similar as possible amount as the first time. And remember both of those details for the second deck to make them both the same size. Machining down and backtacking about level with where we started. We can look at the non-chalked side, which is usually the fabric side, to see whether the run of stitching looks good. We want both to be identical, or at least close to it, but it should be easy to count the same number and move to fraction, if applicable, for the second deck. When the stitching is good, give both an iron to press out any minor tightness created by the machine, like always. We'll cut around the stitching, leaving about 1 centimeter. We need to cut 2 small pieces of fusing to go on the arrow where the buttonhole is going to be. Cut them so that they don't infringe on the stitching. Extend a little into the arrow and at least the length of the buttonhole down from the base of the arrow, not even 2 centimeters long. Always on the fabric side because it's the more important one that is more likely to fray. We need to cut away the fabric and silicea at the points of the deck so that it sits nicely when it's folded right way out. On the 3 corners of each. Take out enough, but not too much, not too close to the stitching, otherwise we may get a hole in the corner when we turn it out. Keep 1 millimeter or so from the stitching is what I'm saying. Fold and iron the silicea, always the silicea over the stitching, towards the inside. The silicea because the cloth is more likely to fray if overly worked. Fold the seam allowance over both sides of the point and iron it down. Not totally necessary, but we can use some cloth soap on the silicea, which will just hold it all together and down a bit better. We will flip them out at this point. However you see fit, I'm using my knot knitting needle, turning over a cuff at the open end and putting the knot point into there and pulling the deck over. To get the edges out and clean, I'm not pushing the point into the seam. What I am doing is massaging the corners, not really applying too much force. I just want the seam to be on the edge. We don't need the fabric to bleed into the back side. Just make sure that the stitching is pulled to the perimeter and it's pressed flat. A thought is to pinking shear the open edge of the deck so that it's less likely to fray and maybe a little more aesthetic should it be pulled out. To mark the buttonhole, the start of the button is down the center and at the base of the triangle at the top. So I'm marking down the width of my button plus 1 millimeter or so, usually 5/8 of an inch or 16 millimeters. Finding the center line of my DAC is easy given the pattern, but usually I need to measure the midpoint somewhere on the DAC, and I can join that to the point of the arrow. Find the center line, basically. We need the elastic too. The most we'll need is half the waist measurement cut in two. We're going to put the elastic in a couple of centimeters. To attach the elastic, like I said, insert it a few centimeters. Maybe with a wider stitch length, near the bottom, go back and forth a few times. We do not want this stitching to tear out. Then angle the DAC in the machine a little and go back and forth a bit. We don't want this stitching to come out. At the top of those stitches, straighten the DAC again and go back and forth a bit. We do not want this stitching coming out. Cut the hole and make the buttonhole. We'll make the buttonholes in largely the same way as usual, or on a small stitch, the three sides, leaving the point open. I have a video on the matter already, but usually, making trousers, we don't use GIMP to give the whole body. It's too stiff for trousers. We need to have joined the front and back trouser before we can start making the waistband for Daks. Take some bandroll canvas, enough to eclipse the waistband, so extending beyond the bearer, and fly to beyond the inlay at the centre back as well. Half plus the waist plus 16 centimeters as usual. Have the piece of canvas laying as mirror images on top of each other. Lay the canvas onto the trouser, from the front, ideally from the bearer. With a ballpoint pen we can mark on the canvas where the side seam is. On the canvas which extends into the back trouser, we can just write a B to indicate that it's the back of the trouser. It helps us not to have to think too hard about it. Do that on both pieces, which is why we laid them mirroring each other, so we can write on both and it'll be correct. Get rid of the trouser and get the waistband pieces. If you want to overlock the straight edges, we can overlock them before we put them together. Overlock the four pieces separately. We'll start with the back pieces, lay them wrong side up next to our canvas. We want to fold the fabric back about 5 centimeters and line it up to the point we marked, denoting the side seam. We could line them up at the back, fold it away and cut the excess, or, like me, fold it about 5 centimeters and line it up to the mark and cut the excess from the back. It's a little bit more difficult for me since I'm trying to match the pattern, but with the front piece, lay it also wrong side up, overlapping the back piece by a little bit more than the back is folded, so that the seams don't sit on top of one another. Make sure the straight edges of the waistband are lined up as well. We'll pin them in place. We basically need to do a machine based across the opening with a wide stitch, since we're going to need to remove it later. Make a stitch right along the edge of the fold on the back, and don't back tack at all. Nearer the edge as well, we need to make a stitch holding the folded and overlapping bits of the waistband. 1 centimeter or so from the edge, essentially so that we won't see this stitch when we get it onto the waistband and covered in lining. Still don't bother backtacking, but make sure it goes beyond the ends of both overlaps and doesn't push anything anywhere. Remove the pins. I've written that I got very confused here. Not sure what that's about, but we need to give the correct canvas to the correct piece of waistband. In the normal way, with the fabric wrong side up, and place the canvas onto the straight edge with about 1 centimeter overlapping with the bias tape on the canvas facing upwards. We also want to line up the fold of the fabric to the mark representing the side seam, making sure the back is on the back of the canvas, where we marked the B. I'm changing the overlap from 1 centimeter to something else because I don't want the selvage to show and I want the pattern to line up. I want the check to go right through the middle of the waistband. With a plain fabric, I wouldn't have to think about it. I know where the overlap that I want is, so I'm just pinning the correct sides of the waistband together, and I'll align the seams when I put it in the machine. I found a very faint line in the pattern that I can use to line the canvas up to. I'm moving the canvas up to that line in small sections, holding them together, machining that small section and then aligning the next. All having already lined up the parts I want lined up to the side seam. And you can kind of see that it is lined up. At the end of the waistband, because I cut the wedge out of the bearer side of the canvas, I'm moving the canvas into the waistband about the same amount as I cut away, sewing off of the waistband. Setting the waistbands after that in the normal way. Firstly, I suggest chalking the waistline on. Then line up the folded seams of the appropriate waistband on the side seam. Since we don't usually put much ease into the front trouser with the waistband, we can mark the center front of the trouser directly onto the waistband. We can measure from the center front towards the back of the trouser, half the waist measurement. I'm starting from the back, line up the back point we marked to the center back of the trouser, which is 1 centimeter in front of the mark stitches. Easing in the fabric so that the fold on the waistband lines up to the side seams. Then we'll basically put the waistband on the front trouser straight, flat together. Same on the bearer side, except it almost wasn't long enough, so I had to ease in a little across the front, still making sure the side seam lines up to the opening on the waistband, and the waistline still ends up the same circumference. The Daks don't affect how the waistband is sewn on, just the same as you know how from previous videos. Once we get to sewing the seat seam, we are going to put the Daks in. Draw the seat seam on like normal, and we need to cut out the stitching holding the side seam portion of the waistband closed, clearing the threads away neatly. Each Dak doesn't have a particular side. We need to get the elastic between the waistbands and the fabric through the opening. The best way, as far as I'm aware, is fold the elastic over one end of a ruler and push them into the opening until it comes out of the center back. Place the Daks into the assumed position. The first button is usually around 1.5 centimeters from the opening, and baste it in place. Again, I'm pattern matching, so do as I say, not as I do. Then with the elastic, make sure it's laying flat inside of the waistband, not under any tension or stretching at all, but not bunched up inside of it either. On the inlay, baste the elastic in place as well. From here we can sew the seat seam like normal, and the elastic will be held in place by said seat seam. Once it's done though, we can cut away the excess elastic so that it's flush with the waistband's inlay. Really, at any point after putting in the Daks and putting in the lining, we can apply the buttons. To find the placement, we usually mark where the buttonhole on the Dak is sitting, and then the next button is 2.5 centimeters from there, and the third is 1 inch from there. However, because I have a pattern, I'm kind of doing it my own way, so when the middle button is used, the pattern matches perfectly, although I think that may have been a coincidence. The wearer can cinch the waist by 10 centimeters though. Like always, I'm just going to gloss over the buttons and link off to my other video.